All right, sweet. Yo, what's up, everybody?
What's
Good
going
afternoon,
on?
good evening, good whatever time it is where you're at right now. So, welcome to another episode. I'm going to stop counting and we'll just keep track of the count in the description. It's 12? Okay. All right, we're on 12. And last time, right, we were discussing platform engineering. We discussed some like executive priorities in the space, blah, blah, blah. And today, I kind of wanted to go through some things that I've been seeing today in discussions I've had and just kind of see where it takes us. It's probably going to be around kind of strategy as a whole from a personal career perspective, from an organizational perspective, and kind of navigating this entire tech space. But we'll see what happens. So, is there anything you want to say before we get started? Because
Thanks to all those who continue to log in and watch. Remember to share, subscribe, hit that like button. Helps to get in front of more eyes, and the more we can share, more guests we can have. Let us know how we can adjust the show to make it what we want to make it. But outside of that, man, let's run.
Sweet. So, I had a colleague reach out to me today, and he asked me, hey, Gerald, what are some patterns? And he specifically asked for like the top 3 patterns that I see in the platform engineering space, this whole DevOps, platform engineering, blah, blah, blah space, that companies are struggling with and where the largest impact happens around companies who are kind of wrangling with this whole, how do we automate our infrastructure so that we can compete by getting our applications in front of customers as quickly as possible? Because like we kind of talked about on the last podcast, infrastructure is really kind of the root of the problem when it comes to things taking so much time. Like, it takes a bit to write the applications for your teams to do that. But a lot of the bottlenecks arise in that, hey, we have to actually get our application usable in front of customers. All of that is infrastructure. So, yeah, hopefully folks are kind of caught up on that. So he asked me the question, and I answered it, just kind of riffing on it, right? I know there's a lot around companies struggling with how to safely implement a self-service workflow for developers and development teams so that they can actually go in and create infrastructure themselves. That's like a major pattern. There's a lot of bottlenecks and stuff there. The manual approval side and the need for many manual approvals, that's a big challenge as well. How do we kind of reduce the number needed even though we can't get rid of all of them? And of course, like how we respond in a legal audit type situation. Okay. And I gave him those 3 just because like those are the 3 patterns that popped up off the top of my mind. Then I went through and I was like, how many customers have I actually talked to and worked with on this stuff?
Okay.
And I looked at the archives of all of my diagrams and notes of doing these kind of infrastructure automation, workflow assessments. And I came down to, I don't even think I found all of them. It was 36 customers that I've done this with across kind of like the Fortune 500 through like the Global 2000 space. For y'all that don't know, that's just how like our world classifies how big a company is.
Yeah.
So Fortune 500, Fortune 100, Global 2000. Anyway.
That's not the first time I ever heard of Global 2000, but
Yeah, there's a lot of categories.
yeah.
So like you have all these companies of various sizes all struggling with the same thing. And I'm looking through all of this and I'm seeing a bunch of stuff. And I literally just started really kind of combing through all of these examples.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking overall, right? Because it's a big question. It's a big landscape. We talk about how tech is just this massive space in general. And so you dive into tech and then you dive into this subcategory of like application development. And then you have a subcategory of infrastructure, automation, and platform engineering, DevOps, and those are
Right.
kind of like all in this other infrastructure subcategory.
Mm-hmm.
So operating in that space, my questions right now, based on the data that I've gathered, is what strategy actually makes sense? What strategy actually makes sense for these companies that are all having these very clear struggles across the board?
Do you think it could be as simple as one strategy uniting them all and fixing their things? Or is it we've talked before about having a suite of options that an enterprise could pick from in order to move forward? Or that's the only part of this that kind of confuses me. When we think of what's the solution, is the solution how we're even looking at these problems? Is it changing the angle in which we're walking upon these diagrams to pull back information so we can make informed decisions for these enterprises?
It's an interesting question. I think really you kind of have to just define clearly what strategy means in this space.
Okay.
All right. And it's funny, right? We talked a little bit about Wardley mapping before the podcast, but I don't want to go down the deep rabbit hole of Wardley mapping because the mapping exercise in of itself isn't really what's important. There are principles that you use to assess where you're at strategically, right? So we're going to talk about a couple different strategies.
Okay.
The first strategic viewpoint, right, because your strategy is going to be different depending on who you are. The first strategic viewpoint is from like a CEO running a company.
Okay.
A lot of like leadership stuff you see or things you consume strategically, we'll talk about kind of the CEO executive level of leadership. But it applies much deeper than just that. And I believe the core tenets of Wardley mapping, and we can pull it up if I forget, but the core tenets were I need to figure out the landscape that I'm operating in.
Mm-hmm.
Very first, though, I need to figure out my purpose.
Yeah.
So what's the purpose of your company? What's the purpose of your team? What's your individual purpose? And what are you trying to accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
Because everything else after that will be guided by that original purpose. So then you figure out the landscape, right? Where are you operating? What exactly, how is the terrain around you, whatever that terrain is, whether you're an individual software engineer in a company, what's the landscape of your organization? How do things operate? What's going on? So you have to have an idea of how it works. Then there's climate, which is the things around you that you can't control, kind of the greater things that be. Have an idea of what's going on in the climate around you. And then, what's the final one? Let me pull it up.
Yeah, I mean, while you do, I think it's interesting that you view it from a CEO standpoint to start. And a lot of people, I'd say most people, are not in that position professionally, but you are the CEO of your own personal journey, of your own personal career. So taking the same view that a CEO of a business or an enterprise takes so that they can market towards their customer and reach their goal is very similar to what we could do on a personal level. Even before you get to this next one, a big thought I had, I've mentioned this book before on the pod. It reminds me of The Goal, the book that the Phoenix Project was based off, because the entire purpose of that book is to figure out what the enterprise's purpose is for existing. Mm-hmm. So it might vary in different places. Did you find the?
Yeah, I found it. So we talk about purpose, why you do what you do. Landscape, what's the terrain you're operating on? What's going on around you? Climate, what are the things beyond your control that just like are happening around you that you need to be aware of? Doctrine, right, which is from a leadership perspective, how am I instructing the people around me that I'm responsible for to get the job done that they need to get done? Assuming that they're good at what they do, they're competent, right? What is the doctrine that we teach? And then finally, this all revolves around to leadership, right? Leadership being based on your expertise, taking all the other things into consideration. How are you then directing the people under you, right? Now, from a CEO executive level perspective, which is the perspective in which this is taught, this ideal, that makes a lot of sense. But like you said, this idea of how to think strategically, how to understand purpose, assess your landscape, assess the climate, and then do what you need to do when you need to do it, how to develop a strategy, applies across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting things that I think is applicable across the board is this difference in whys, like why of purpose, which I think is actually in this diagram. Yeah. Why of purpose is really just like your purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? But then everything else, your landscape, your climate, the doctrine, your leadership, all of that is why they call it the why of movement, right? Like, why am I making a certain move? And they use this chess illustration a lot where, you know, and a lot of executives, they just love chess. Any
I
executive
started
book,
playing like this week. I'm gonna get
yeah?
smoked online. Like it's really bad. But that's why I smile. But keep
Chess is fun.
It is. I'm gonna learn.
So the why of movement is where things get interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of folks, the assertion is a lot of folks don't understand their climate, their landscape, any of those things. And the illustration is like playing chess without a board. So you just have these pieces and you're like clicking on each piece and you don't really know how, like, the effect it's going to have on the board.
Mm-hmm. I know it can move, but I don't know where it moves.
You don't know what's going on. And there's another common like business tool used a lot in a lot of places, is the SWOT analysis.
Mm-hmm.
You heard of those?
Strengths,
Yeah.
weaknesses. I forget the A&T.
And that's great, right? Like, okay, cool, but you still don't understand your landscape or the climate. Like, it's chess without a board. You understand the pieces, you understand what they do, but you don't have a strategy yet. You tracking with what I'm saying?
Absolutely. So let's taking this and looking at it. You know, I find it really interesting because people struggle to find their purpose. They oftentimes believe it's this huge, drawn-out experience that it has to be. People feel like once they find a purpose can't shift or change. So, and especially in today's world with the constant overflow of stimulus technology, I personally believe in order to find that purpose, you have to be willing to be still. You have to be willing to just sit down and truly focus and plan. And it's not a skill a lot of people have. So the question I'd ask you, it would be, how would you find a purpose, or how would you find your purpose from a personal career perspective?
So the perspective helps because your purpose is going to be different depending upon the strategy you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
Like me personally, as just a human being, my core purpose is to, you know, take care of my family.
Absolutely.
Try to make it so, you know, they have a life that I didn't, and, you know, try to bring glory to my God. Those are like purpose items, personal.
Yeah.
But then in business, it gets interesting. And in your career, it gets interesting. What are you really trying to do? So if you bring it to the career, right, I have my base purpose. So my career purpose needs to support my base.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, my purpose in my career is to be the best I can at what I do, and very tangibly make as much money in the shortest amount of time possible. Like that's it, because it's really a sub-purpose. It's not my entire purpose.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's okay to have multiple purposes.
Yeah, like you're a dynamic individual.
Exactly.
Right. And I don't think work has to be your entire purpose. And it really isn't for most people. They have lives outside of that. I mean, there are people that it is their entire purpose in life, and they've dedicated themselves to. And that comes with its own consequences,
Indeed.
right? But if I'm going to define what I want out of my career, and it's being guided on the lines of how can I make the most in the shortest amount of time? How can I be a master of my craft, right? Because I believe that working for mastery of your craft also enhances your own personal worth and your confidence and all of these very positive effects just by working hard to be good at what you do. So with that in mind, then I go, okay, I have a job now. Right now I'm in tech. Okay, I have those core things. Now I have to figure out how to strategically navigate where I'm at. So I may come in as a role of a software engineer, right? But I'll speak personally a little bit more recently, right? So I came in from being like cloud architect software engineer to being a solutions engineer. That's because for me, I know that I want to understand how the business of software works. That's one of my goals. That's something that I'm fundamentally curious about. So I want to continue honing my technical skills while understanding how these products are built and shipped to customers and what customers actually like and blah, blah, blah. Like I want to understand how to be good at that.
Absolutely.
So I had been working as a practitioner in the space, building software a long time. Now I transferred over strategically to a solutions engineering role, where now I'm advising other customers who are building software and helping them on their journey of building software by addressing specific problems. The problem space that I chose was this infrastructure automation DevOps space because that was what I saw was the biggest problem.
Gotcha.
And I asked myself, how big of a problem is this everywhere else? And the answer is it's a problem everywhere in every company that builds software. Okay. So that's a little bit of the landscape. Like that's landscape thinking, right? I'm trying to understand not only what I'm doing, but how it plays.
Exactly. How it's affecting things around you.
Okay. So now I understand that I'm in a decent spot, at least from my assessment of the landscape, which could always be wrong, right? Like your strategy could be wrong, but it's a helpful aid in how you think about it.
I think a big thing, and what we researched about this beforehand, is that this mapping tool, even for base level diagrams to how advanced it can get, it's what we call in Agile, it's an information radiator. Because at the very least, it brings things to the forefront visually. These types of things bring, whether it's the purpose, landscape, it makes them physical in some senses, visual in some senses, and keeps them just from being thoughts in your mind. And once you can visually see them and how they interconnect, then you can make decisions based on it. It's the same reason that they put boards with sticky notes up. It's because if everything's in your head, then nobody else can help you. But once you have these conversations and we're creating these diagrams, we're creating these maps, it helps those around to drive conversation to hopefully giving a more accurate view of the situation, even if that initial strategy is wrong.
Yeah, it is. And it allows you to apply concrete words and definitions to something that before a tool like this would be heavily instinctual, right? So there would be individuals that pick up on patterns, and then they're like, oh, this works, I'm going to keep doing that, right? And then they keep doing that. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that, but it becomes very difficult with that approach to actually collaborate with others.
True.
Like, that's also an important tenet of what I'm trying to do, is to build a strategy in which you can collaborate with others, get clear feedback from others, right, on your strategy, on the pros and cons of certain approaches, or maybe I didn't see the landscape correctly, or maybe I'm not assessing the climate correctly, right? Maybe there's a different way that we could help our people, right?
But Gerald, if I know the trends and no one else knows the trends, doesn't that make me more valuable in my current situation?
Yeah, I would think so.
I would think so too. So what advantage do I gain by not hoarding that knowledge and riding those waves?
I think it's just a fundamental ideology thing. Like, what has been good that's been hoarded? Like, I just,
that's Britain, but
you know, I'm much more of the thought process. I'm much more tied to the thought process of open source, of learning together, learning out loud. And even if you're trying to build a company, even if you hoard it for your company, right? If you're CEO and you're hoarding this knowledge for your company, it's still difficult for people within your company to understand your strategy.
Absolutely.
So even if you're hoarding it for yourself in your company, at the bare minimum, these tools can help you gain good feedback from the people that work with you.
Exactly. There's always a limit to how much one brain can scale things. So you might be able to build a business, keeping all the information and ideas on trends and strategic themes to yourself. But there's going to come a point where hopefully if you're surrounding yourself with like-minded people who are also intelligent, that you're going to need to share the information in order to thrive. Now, excuse me, that's the business thought of it. I always think of it from the opposite side, because when I work, I work. And when I don't work, I don't work. So the thought is the guy who knows everything can't go home to have dinner. I know I've said that here before, but if I'm responsible with all the information and I'm not spreading it amongst those who I'm working alongside, I'm going to be the person they always call to answer a question. So that's the main reason that I see, and that's a large issue on top of what a lot of different enterprises is informational silos, to where people are purposefully holding on to those trends and those informations because it makes them feel as if they're more valuable, therefore irreplaceable in those situations. But they don't realize the benefit that when you're identified as a person who shares information and can grow and scale a team because you're willing to, that makes you more valuable to the organization that you're with.
Yeah, I've had colleagues, I think there's a balance, as there is with all things, right?
Yeah.
Like, you want to be smart. Like, you don't in a closed room have an idea. You have people around you that are shysty and you know that they might steal your stuff and take credit for it and all of that. Okay, I guess, be quiet and then share it in a more opportune time.
Absolutely.
But largely, like, I've had colleagues come to me and I've had ideas and I've chosen to share them, and I've had folks ask me, why didn't you just take that and do that for yourself? First off, I still could, right? Just because you share information doesn't mean they're going to be able to do it.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing.
That's right.
And then the next thing is you win by the crowd, the community. The crowd ends up advocating for you. When you share information under the purpose of I'm trying to help, I'm trying to enhance other people's lives, and I'm giving it freely, those people end up singing your praises, and there's no question as to who this came from.
Exactly.
Right. That just is kind of a natural consequence of being open and doing this stuff in the open, if that makes sense. But like going back to the personal career thing, right? Like, I jumped into solutions engineering. I wanted to understand the sales side. I wanted to understand how that worked. Learned a lot. Now I work technically as kind of this software engineer within the marketing side. And they call us developer advocates. And I'm learning marketing, right? Because I want to understand how the business works. This is all really, if I'm thinking about it, my way of trying to understand the landscape of where I'm at and trying to get more insight into the climate even beyond my company. That's kind of a practical application of how you can do it in your career. And people may choose to do it very differently. If you just get into a job and you're like, I just want to work my job, I don't care about how the whole software business works, right? I just would like to be good at what I do and, excel at a normal pace. When you get in, understand what's happening around you, understand the people around you, understand how work flows, right? Understand people say this in different ways, right? Understand who you need to go to get certain things done, blah, blah, blah. And most importantly, understand how you can best contribute.
Exactly.
Because a lot of it revolves back to your motive, like how this plays out for you. I've seen a lot of it goes back to what is motivating you to even assess your landscape in the first place. I've seen people come into an organization and assess the landscape for the purpose of just trying to take advantage of people. Try to figure out how to undermine people. Yeah. Right? Like, they play this very dirty political game that just doesn't make any sense to me. So they'll come in, they'll do that, they'll try to undermine, and then it ends up kind of coming back to them because people see eventually what they're trying to do. Exactly. But if you do it with the motive of, I'm trying to figure out how I can best help and contribute as a whole, now you're putting yourself in a position for success and for having good relationships with others. That's like, as a personal career thing, I think that's what sets you up for excelling on the career ladder. That's what sets you up for making the top dollar for whatever your particular role is, doing those things. And it's a good strategy overall. Does that make sense? Do you have any
Yeah.
follow-up questions on that particularly? Because I'm going to zoom out a little bit.
No. You're fine. Keep
All
going.
right. So zoom that out now. Okay, we go beyond the employee, right, to now an organization, now companies.
Mm-hmm.
Running companies is different. That was another thing that I wanted to learn about, and why I'm glad I've been able to kind of get in and interview and work with a bunch of companies. Because I want to see what they're thinking. I want to see what their
Exactly.
priorities are. What do you all even care about? Why is this a thing, right? So we look at those companies, and you're like, oh, okay, you all have very similar problems.
Mm-hmm.
That's the landscape, right? Then there's the landscape of these technical tools that all of these companies are using to solve these specific problems.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the climate above that affects specific industries. Certain companies are now under certain constraints that other companies under. Certain companies flourish. Certain companies kind of lack performance.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's about things beyond even them,
Yeah.
right? So coming back to like zooming out around this infrastructure automation and platform engineering thing, landscape-wise, everyone is struggling with it. Patterns-wise, there's like key open source tools and non-open source tools that most everybody's using. And most everybody's trying to use the same things, do the same things. But the thing in the mistake I feel like companies that are building software are making is they're building a piece of software that addresses a specific problem, and it may be great at that problem. Let's just assume that it's great at that problem.
Sure.
But they ignore the strategic element of actually solving the problem inside of the customer's landscape. Because the customer that we're working with, the organization we're working with, has their own landscape, has their own climate, has their own
Absolutely.
doctrines, right? The things that they actually put out.
Yeah.
So trying to assess, when you're walking in and you're like, hey, I have this software that can solve your problem, right? What I see a lot of happening is people looking at it and being like, hey, we have the software that can solve your problem. It costs us so much money, buy the thing, right? And the customer may be like, why though? Like what?
Mm-hmm.
Why should I buy it? Like I understand, but I mean, I have these open source tools. I have these other tools that I use. Like, what's the power of it? And that's what I feel like I've ended up capturing by accident.
Gotcha.
It's like how these companies strategically approach infrastructure automation
Mm-hmm.
and their DevOps practices and their platform engineering practices. And there's pitfalls in a lot of these strategies, and there's people that have been pretty successful and are pretty good at it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this entire spectrum of people that are at different stages in maturity and how they're implementing this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I say all that because it's big on my mind right now, obviously, because I'm working through all of it. But I think it's valuable for people to understand, especially if you're in a role that requires you to sell software,
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to have to take some time to understand how your customer is strategically working to accomplish their goal. And what that looks like is different than what it's looked like in the past.
How so?
In the past, right, you would walk into a customer and you would say, hey, let's do initial presentation. Here's this thing. Next meeting, hey, how are you using our product today? Or how are you solving this problem today? Maybe do a whiteboard, etc. But back in the day of technical sales, I would say, maybe 5-10 years ago, the software that was being sold was, I think, a lot simpler in ways.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was a lot more, hey, here's a user interface, here's a website, and it has these graphs and things on it, and you can plug it in and it does this cool thing. Or it was a lot more physical, where you had these physical machines that you were selling, and it was very different, right? The tools today, the tools that focus on automation of these very complex things that we're talking about, they require people to think differently about solving these problems than they have in the past.
Okay.
And there's 100 different ways to do it.
It's not just one piece of software that goes on top of your current operation. This could very well change your entire operation and call for more efficient value being delivered.
Yeah. Like take just provisioning of infrastructure, okay? Like I need to create a Kubernetes cluster. I need to create a virtual machine. I need to go through the process of doing that. The process of that alone encompasses many tools. Okay, like we have our networks that need to be configured depending on where we're actually hosting our infrastructure and what cloud provider, or if it's private cloud, that's going to be done in a slightly different way. You have tools like Terraform to actually do that as infrastructure as code. You also have the cloud native equivalent of each of those tools. Then on top of that, you have pipelines to actually try and automate now your infrastructure, you're capturing it as code.
Yeah.
Well, now I need to actually apply software engineering practices. I need to version my infrastructure. I need to ideally cut releases so that I can keep track of all these things. And then that triggers these pipelines, and there's a slew of pipeline tools across the board. Like there's a ton of different tools that do the exact same thing and support many different types of processes, right? But how your people work together to accomplish this is what separates the people that are doing it right and the people that aren't able to get it done.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does. And is that a matter of overall strategic themes of how they push work through, or do you believe that could just solely be fixed with the technology?
I think it's both. It's how you push work through. It's how you accept work, right? So like for provisioning, as an example, a company will accept work like, say, an application team, I need this unit of infrastructure. They accept that work in. That one team often isn't the stopping team for all the tasks that need to be done. Usually there's a ton of other teams on top of it that they have to interface with, get approvals from. Management have to approve a bunch of stuff, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Right. So the people aspect is we're getting these requests in. People need infrastructure from us. How do we handle that initially, right? And usually the people handling that initially is a cloud team or a platform team or whatever that organization calls that team. How do we handle it up front? What tools are we using to actually provision that infrastructure, right? Because they want to take a hold of it because they want to make sure that it's done safely and correctly.
Makes sense.
That makes sense, right? But the people that are really doing it right are not just automating certain pieces of the code. They're actually automating a lot of those security checks. So they're that's the whole policy as code thing.
Yeah.
Right? Where all our corporate policies that we have, let's codify that too. So now all you need is the business approval of, hey, you're cleared to build this app. And 80%, I would say 80% should be the goal. 80% of all the infrastructure required to build that app should be in a self-service manner accessible to development teams. So they don't have to go to your team and now your team's the bottleneck because you got 500 to 1,000 requests coming in from different teams. So that's just one thing. Now in that workflow, right, like of the team that receives it, they're using Terraform. They're using a secrets manager like Vault or a cloud native one. They're using a different runtime. Sometimes different apps they have on different runtimes, like Kubernetes, of course, is the big dog. Then you have like ECS, all these different ones across all the cloud providers of where your app actually goes and lives and how those compute resources are managed under your app.
Makes sense.
Then you have how you handle that network connectivity, right? Whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, and it's all handled slightly different and these different approvals depending upon what it is, blah, 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 right? That's just provisioning of infrastructure and the pieces underneath. And it's funny, right? Because provisioning infrastructure ends up touching networking, ends up touching your credential management, ends up touching all of these pieces because the process of provisioning a piece of infrastructure needs all that.
Exactly.
You're also hitting all your pipelines. So now, if you're doing things as code, you're committing to a Git repository, and then that triggers a pipeline. And then when you merge over to another branch, and now it's your production branch, it triggers all kinds of other pipelines. All of these things give you the ability to do automated checks, and people have been using them and growing and becoming more mature in the sense that I think 5+ years ago, these companies were deploying maybe once every year, every year and a half. And we kind of talked about that in the last podcast. And now they're deploying every 3 months, which is a lot of progress.
But still too slow.
But it's still too slow. There's companies like the True North is funny, and it's like laughable for a lot of these companies to them because they can't see a path to it. Some of these companies are deploying 100 times a day.
Exactly.
That's nuts to them. They're like, what? How in the, like, no, we're not even trying to do that. We're not trying to be that. And I get that sentiment. And I don't think you need to try and get there. But you can definitely take the steps to try and get better, because I think once you go from, oh, we've improved it to 6 months or 3 months, now let's improve it to 3 months or a month and a half, like we talked about.
Constantly checking back in on it.
Exactly. That's this strategy. Understanding strategically how each customer, each individual organization, their landscape, their climate, what they're going through, in the space of, within the scope of the problem you're trying to solve too.
Yes.
Because you got to clearly define what you're trying to solve. We're trying to solve infrastructure automation. That's what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Because I think it's just the biggest low-hanging fruit problem in our industry today. Like, I honestly feel like we've gotten a lot better at writing apps themselves. I think Agile's helped a lot with that. I think that, well, yeah, it takes time, but it's more predictable than it has been in a long time. You know the skills that you need in order to write these features, like,
and the iterative nature makes sure that what gets out is what's supposed to get out. That whatever assumptions we made when we took this project on are still accurate down the line.
Yeah, and that's much more mature. And of course, there's still a lot of work to do there, but it's much more mature than this other space, this DevOps, platform engineering, infrastructure automation space. So yeah, man, I guess zooming out, like, if you're working with these customers and this is a space that you work in, you're going to have to take a little more time. You're going to have to adapt a little bit. And this isn't going to be like a lot of your other jobs. And that's across the board. Like, it's not the company I work at. I see the landscape, looking at the landscape. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to jump or cut you off, but I don't think it's just specific to that. Because even when we first started discussing this, I can see easy application to a situation I'm currently walking into. I'm walking into a train or a group that supports, half of a region's banking supply. So when I'm the fresh face, they want to make these changes. I have to take a look at all these things. All right, what is the purpose of what we're building here? And my role in it? Okay, well, I want to make sure that we're predictably moving work through the system, that we know what comes in, we make sure we're accurately described, and then we can push it through as well. Well, what is the landscape? We're heavily regulated because we are half of a global market. So a lot of the things, it's not like, I'll tell you an example that's not specifically related to me, but I'm talking to a colleague that works in Brazil. And he was just like, we handle the global bank payments and deposits that coming out of Brazil, but Brazil is heavily regulated. So there's a percentage of the team's capacity that's reserved every quarter just in case Brazil goes, hey, you know what? You got to do this. Or we can't do business. And then they spend time and they go through that capacity. Oh, you know what? Hey, remember that thing we told you 2 quarters ago? We don't like that. You can't have that. Tear it all down and build it new. But because of the variability, the volatility of that market, they have to go through it. So that's climate. Those are things that we can't really change. It's because that's what it costs to do business in this landscape or in this period. So I do understand. And then leadership, of course. I'm still trying to figure out people's internal pain points and motivations and how, like, the why. Why do we lead in a way? Why do we pull certain things in? That's where I think it kind of coincides with the goal, because we want to know what the purpose of this team is, what the purpose of the work we're doing is. So I don't think this necessarily, and I know you weren't saying it, but it only applies to someone in a sales engineer or a solution engineer role, because you're dealing with customers. I think anybody at any level after looking through this could take a look into what they have around them and just, you kind of have to dig to find the answers to these questions. What is my role here? Where are my feet in regards to what's around me? What's around me that I have no control over? And where are we trying to go as a result of me being here to do this thing? And once you have those things ironed out in front of you, it'll help create a path towards advancement, true value being brought. And you won't feel like we talked about earlier, you won't feel like you have to hold the trend, because you know the recipe of how to find the trend. So as long as you know how to find them, you'll always find something.
Yeah. And the only thing on top of that is, if you're in a position where you're responsible for others, making sure that you're teaching them the things they need in order to accomplish the strategy at hand.
Yeah.
Like making sure your doctrines, your principles as a leader, and what you put out to your teams as an organization and as a leader within that organization drive towards the purpose that you've outlined. And if there is not, like if you're doing something or teaching something that's not, you need to adapt quickly.
Exactly.
That's part of it, and that's the nice thing about documenting these things. I think you're right that it definitely applies across the board. The challenges that I'm currently facing, because I work with engineers, I work with sales representatives, I work with solutions engineers, and I work with executives. And so like all of these people I'm looking at, and I'm seeing these different patterns. I think just because of, like I said, the problem I'm working on right now, the sales side of it pops up in my mind a lot. And the marketing side of it pops up in my mind a lot, because I see how we're doing product development, and the product development looks pretty solid.
Absolutely.
Like the feedback loops are established well. They're moving at a good pace. They're constantly moving in an agile fashion, doing the proper retrospectives, trying to make sure that we're aware of what our customers want and building accordingly. That is not perfect, but it's incremental gains at this point. I see a massive problem in the other spaces.
Gotcha.
It's not just with the folks I work with who are all amazing, competent people. It's a shift, I think, in the industry in general that kind of seems like what's happening. Like the types of tooling, the types of conversations that we're having are just very different than what was.
Yeah.
Any company, like I think of a few of them that pop to mind. I was looking at Harness, Solo.io, Kong, insert any software company, any company that builds software and sells it in some capacity now are building these types of tools.
Yeah.
The other types of tools are very few and far in between, and I don't even think the market really wants them as much. So, I don't know. It's interesting. Leave in the comments if you think I'm talking nonsense or whatever. Go ahead and let us know. I'm curious to hear people's thoughts, because these are just kind of some of the things that I'm seeing. And I'm going to document a lot of that, like after reviewing the 36 and the ones that I'm still doing now, and kind of document what those patterns are and what they look like, and how that plays into the overall tech landscape of DevOps and platform engineering.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I know that was a long tangent about strategy, right?
It's important.
But it was good. And honestly, I think it's okay to kind of end it there. Like I'm curious to see what people think about it. I think it's a very pointed topic that touches on a lot of things that people care about in our space.
Yeah.
So I'm good with leaving it there if you're good with leaving it there. Awesome. Well, hey guys, thank you for watching. We appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we'll see you next week.
Most definitely.